The Duke of Ashford had dismissed hundreds of people in his lifetime. Servants who spilled, tenants who begged, distant cousins who arrived uninvited with soft hands and hopeful eyes. He dismissed them all with the same efficiency he applied to everything else: a glance, a word, a turn back, clean, final. He had never once considered that a dismissal could be a mistake. On the morning Evelyn Voss arrived at Ashford Manor, Thomas Briggs, valet, keeper of 30 years of Ashford silence, stood in the entry hall and watched his employer walk past a woman without looking at her. He said nothing. But his hands, clasped behind his back, tightened until his knuckles went white. He had known her name since before she could speak it herself. The Duke had not yet earned the right to hear it. The carriage that brought Evelyn Voss to Ashford Manor was not impressive. It was a hired conveyance, the kind that smelled of damp wool and other people's journeys, and it arrived 20 minutes late because one of the horses had thrown a shoe outside the village. Evelyn had waited by the road without complaint while the driver sorted it, her single trunk beside her, her hands folded in her lap as though she had all the time in the world. She did not, particularly, but she had learned long ago that visible impatience accomplished nothing except to make other people feel powerful. She stepped out of the carriage and looked up at Ashford Manor for the first time. It was exactly as her mother had described it: large without being beautiful, commanding without being warm. The kind of house that had been built to remind people of something: money, lineage, consequence, and had been doing so successfully for 200 years. The stone was gray. The windows were tall and clean. The gardens were immaculate in the way that suggested no one actually enjoyed them. Evelyn picked up her smaller bag herself before the driver could make the awkward calculation of whether she deserved the gesture. She was practiced at removing that particular discomfort from situations. Thomas Briggs was waiting at the top of the steps. She recognized him immediately, not from life, but from her mother's descriptions, which had always been precise. Tall, she had said, careful, the kind of man who notices everything and says very little. You will trust him when you meet him. I always did. He was older now, of course. His hair had gone fully white, and there was a stiffness in his left shoulder that hadn't been in her mother's telling. But his eyes were the same shade of steady gray her mother had mentioned, and when they found Evelyn's face, something moved through them, quick, controlled, and unmistakably recognition, before he smoothed it away. He descended 2 steps and offered a small, correct bow. "Miss Voss, welcome to Ashford Manor. I am Briggs. His Grace asked me to receive you." His Grace asked, not His Grace is here. Evelyn noted the distinction. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," she said. "It's a pleasure." She followed him up the steps and into the entry hall, which was exactly as cold as the exterior had promised. Black and white marble, a staircase that curved upward like a statement, portraits on every wall, each one looking down with the particular expression of people who had been important and knew it. Evelyn did not look at the portraits. Not yet. She was 2 steps inside when she heard him. Not his voice, his footsteps. A man who walked like that had never once questioned whether the floor beneath him was his. Firm, even, unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had somewhere to be and expected the world to accommodate the schedule. The Duke of Ashford came down the staircase with a sheaf of papers in one hand and his attention entirely on them. He was younger than Evelyn had imagined, early 30s, perhaps, and considerably better looking than she had prepared for, which she noted and then set aside as irrelevant. Dark hair, sharp jaw, the kind of face that would have been handsome if it had ever learned to rest. It had not, apparently, learned. Briggs stepped forward. "Your Grace, Miss Voss has arrived. Lady Ashford's new companion, as arranged." "I don't greet companions." He didn't look up from the papers, didn't slow his stride. He was past them and through the far door in 4 more steps, and then the door clicked shut and the entry hall was quiet again. Evelyn stood very still. Briggs stood beside her, and she could feel, without looking, the particular quality of his silence. It was not the silence of a man who agreed with what had just happened. It was the silence of a man who had seen something he recognized and was ashamed of it and could not yet say so. She let 3 seconds pass. Then she said quite pleasantly, "That's all right, Mr. Briggs. I already know what kind of man he is." Briggs turned to look at her then fully, carefully, the way he had been avoiding since the carriage. His expression was composed, but his eyes were not. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I suspect you do." He reached for her trunk himself, waving off the footman who moved to take it, and led her toward the stairs. Evelyn followed. She did not look back at the door the Duke had walked through. She had not come to Ashford Manor for the Duke. Not yet. Ashford Manor had a rhythm, and Evelyn learned it within 3 days. Breakfast at 8, which Lady Ashford, the Duke's mother, a small, watchful woman with excellent posture and tired eyes, took in her sitting room rather than the dining hall. Evelyn's role was to be present, useful, and unobtrusive in equal measure. She poured tea. She read aloud when asked. She listened considerably more than she spoke, which suited her perfectly because people who believed they were not being listened to said remarkably honest things. Luncheon was informal. Dinner was not. The Duke dined at the family table every evening without exception, which Evelyn had not anticipated. She had assumed, based on everything her mother had told her, based on the papers she had read, based on 30 years of careful, quiet preparation, that the Duke of Ashford was a man who preferred his own company. And he did, clearly. But he preferred it at the head of his own table, with the correct number of people arranged around it, because appearances in this house were not optional. Lady Portia joined them most evenings. Evelyn had taken an inventory of Lady Portia Ashford within approximately 40 minutes of their first meeting and reached her conclusions. Portia was the Duke's cousin, his father's brother's daughter, and she had been circling Ashford Manor for years with the patient, deliberate energy of a woman who had identified what she wanted and was simply waiting for the correct moment to take it. She was clever. She was charming when it served her. And she had looked at Evelyn on that first evening with the particular attention of someone who had just identified a variable they hadn't accounted for. Evelyn found her interesting. She was also careful not to show it. The humiliations were small at first, which was how Portia preferred to work. A remark at dinner about Evelyn's dress, not cruel precisely, just slightly too observant. What an interesting choice of fabric, so practical. A question about Evelyn's family background posed in front of the footman, casual and bright, designed to establish a ceiling. "Your people are from the north, I think you said. How rugged that must have been." Evelyn answered everything pleasantly and without defensiveness, which she could see frustrated Portia more than any reaction would have. The Duke, to his credit, or perhaps simply to his indifference, did not participate. He ate. He spoke when addressed on matters of the estate. He read documents at the table, which Lady Ashford tolerated with the resignation of a woman who had stopped fighting that particular battle years ago. He did not look at Evelyn. She did not require him to. What she required was time and access and patience, all 3 of which she had in abundance. On the 4th day she found the library. Not the public library, the formal room on the ground floor with its arranged volumes and its portrait of the first Duke presiding over everything. The other one. The small, unlisted room on the 2nd floor east corridor that didn't appear on the household map Briggs had given her, but that she had located anyway by the simple method of paying attention to where Briggs himself walked when he thought no one was watching. The door was unlocked. She went in. It was a working room, not a decorative one. Papers, ledgers, a desk that had been used by more than one generation of Ashford men, the surface worn in 2 different places, 2 different postures, 2 different lives. The shelves held estate records going back 100 years, organized with the obsessive precision of men who believed that control over documents meant control over reality. Evelyn ran her fingers along the spines without pulling anything out. She was not here to take. Not today. She was here to understand the shape of the place, what was kept, what was ordered, What was, perhaps, missing? She was turning to leave when she heard Briggs in the corridor. She stepped back from the door and waited. His footsteps stopped outside. There was a pause, the particular pause of a man checking that he was unobserved, and then the soft sound of paper. Something being slid beneath the door at the corridor's far end. Not this door. The door at the end, the one that was always locked. Then his footsteps retreated. Evelyn waited until they faded completely. She walked to the far door and looked down. An envelope, already sealed. She could not see the contents, and she would not have opened it regardless, but she could see the handwriting on the front. She had grown up watching that handwriting, had learned her letters from it, had read every note and every instruction and every careful, measured word it had ever produced across 26 years of her life. Her mother's handwriting, on an envelope, in Ashford Manor, being passed to someone behind a locked door. Evelyn straightened up slowly. Her mother had been dead for 4 months. She said nothing at dinner that evening. She poured Lady Ashford's tea. She answered Portia's observation about the weather. She passed the bread without being asked, because she had already learned that the footman on the left was slow and the Duke's patience for waiting was approximately 4 seconds. The Duke glanced at her when she did it. Not a long glance, not a meaningful one. The glance of a man who had noticed an efficiency and was involuntarily cataloging it, the way he cataloged everything. Evelyn looked back at him for exactly 1 second, and then looked away. After dinner, walking back to her room along the east corridor, she passed the locked door. She did not stop. But she thought about her mother's handwriting, about Briggs' careful hands, about an envelope that had no business existing because the woman who wrote it had been buried in a churchyard in Yorkshire 4 months ago. Her mother had planned for this. Evelyn had known she was coming to Ashford Manor for a reason. She was beginning to understand that her mother had been here long before her. Evelyn chose her moment carefully. That was something her mother had taught her, not in a single lesson, not with any particular drama, but across a lifetime of watching a woman navigate circumstances that had never been designed with her comfort in mind. Timing, her mother had said once, folding laundry with the same precision she applied to everything, is not about patience. It is about knowing which door will open and which one will not, and never wasting your weight on the wrong one. Evelyn had been 12 when she heard that. She had understood it completely. She waited 4 more days after the envelope. She found Briggs in the East Garden on a Tuesday morning, doing something that was not precisely his job, deadheading roses along the far wall with the focused attention of a man who needed to be doing something with his hands. The gardener was visible at the opposite end of the grounds. No one else was near. Evelyn walked toward him at an unhurried pace and stopped beside him. She said nothing for a moment, just looked at the roses. There were deep red ones at the center of the wall, older than the rest, their canes thick and slightly wild compared to the disciplined rows on either side. "Those are different from the others," she said. Briggs glanced at them. "They were planted before my time. The late Duke's mother brought them from her family estate when she married." A pause. "They don't conform well. His Grace has suggested replacing them twice. But they're still here." "They are." Evelyn let another moment pass. Then she said quite evenly, "I saw the envelope, Mr. Briggs." His hands went still on the roses. He didn't turn, didn't speak. She watched his shoulders settle into the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for something and had just heard it arrive. "I wasn't looking for it," she continued. "I want you to know that. I wasn't searching your movements or going through rooms I shouldn't have been in. I was in the East Corridor and I saw it, and I recognized the handwriting, and I have thought about very little else for 4 days." Briggs set down his small shears with deliberate care. "Miss Voss." "She's been gone 4 months," Evelyn said. "My mother, 4 months. And whatever she sent to this house, she sent before she died, which means she planned it. Which means she knew something about this place that she chose not to tell me directly." She paused. I'd like to understand why. Briggs finally turned to look at her. In the morning light, his face was older than it seemed indoors, the lines deeper, the gray of his eyes more faded. He looked, Evelyn thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had developed such thorough muscle memory for the weight that he'd almost forgotten it was there. Almost. Your mother, he said carefully, was a woman of considerable foresight. Yes, I know. What did she see from here? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, back at the roses, and she had the distinct impression he was making a calculation, not of whether to speak, but of how much. She and the late Duke, he began and stopped. Go on. They were another stop. He seemed to be testing each word before he allowed it out. Close. In the way that certain people are close when they are young and the world has not yet finished arranging them into their correct positions. Evelyn said nothing. She waited. She was not of his station, Briggs continued. His family, his father, his mother, the entire architecture of what the Ashford name required, none of it permitted what they were to each other. He was told very clearly what his future would look like, and he complied. Briggs paused. He always complied. That was his great flaw and his great virtue simultaneously. He did what was required of him. And my mother. Your mother left. She was asked to, and she went because she understood better than he did. I always thought that staying would have destroyed her more completely than leaving. He was quiet for a moment. She was a sensible woman, sensible and very brave in the way that only quiet people can be brave. Evelyn's throat tightened. She did not let it show. He knew about me, she said. It was not a question. Briggs' answer was in the half-second before he spoke. Yes. He provided for us. Yes, discreetly, consistently, until the day he died. Evelyn nodded once. She had known this, had half known it, had constructed it from the evidence of her own life, the education that should have been beyond her mother's means, the small house that was always kept, the bills that were always met. She had known and not known simultaneously, the way you can know a thing and still need someone to say it plainly before it becomes real. The envelope, she said, what was in it? I am not at liberty. Mr. Briggs. He looked at her again, and this time something in his expression shifted, not broke precisely, but gave slightly at the edges, the way old wood gives under sustained pressure. A letter, he said, written by your mother to the late Duke's solicitor, confirming certain arrangements, certain provisions he had made that were to be honored upon his death. He paused. There was also a letter from the Duke himself, written some years ago and left in your mother's keeping. She was to send it here after she was no longer. He stopped. After she died, Evelyn said. Yes. And where is the Duke's letter now? With the solicitor, who has been searching for you for 8 months. For the first time, something that was almost wry moved through his expression. You found us rather before we found you. Evelyn looked back at the roses. The old ones planted generations ago that didn't conform and hadn't been replaced despite 2 suggestions. Still here, still red. There is something owed to me, she said quietly. I didn't come here to cause difficulty. I came because my mother asked me to, and because there is something here that belongs to me and I would like to have it. I know, Briggs said. I know exactly why you came. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Easier, somehow. The silence of 2 people who had confirmed what they already knew. It lasted precisely until the sound of footsteps on the gravel path behind them. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She had learned, in 4 days at Ashford Manor, to calibrate her reactions to the Duke specifically. Too fast a response gave him information, and she was not yet ready to give him anything. She turned at a natural pace and found him 3 feet away, closer than she'd expected, which meant he had approached quietly. Deliberately or habitually, she wasn't sure yet. He was looking at Briggs. "I need the Carlton correspondence," he said. "It's not on my desk." "I'll bring it within the hour, Your Grace." The Duke's gaze moved to Evelyn, the same brief cataloging glance she had received at dinner, then back to Briggs. "Your deadheading roses." "The gardener is occupied with the south beds, Your Grace." A pause. The Duke looked at the roses himself. Something crossed his face, not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it, something quickly suppressed. "Leave the red ones," he said, and walked back toward the house. Evelyn watched him go. Then she heard Briggs very quietly beside her. "He has said that," Briggs murmured, "every year since his father died." Evelyn said nothing. But she filed it away, carefully, next to everything else she was learning about a man who ran his house like a ledger and left his father's roses untouched every single year without, apparently, knowing why. That evening at dinner, she felt the Duke look at her. Not the catalog glance. Something slower. The look of a man who had gone back to a page he'd already turned and found something on it he hadn't read properly the first time. Evelyn passed the bread to the footman on the left before he could fumble it. She did not look up. Across the table, Lady Portia's eyes moved between them like a compass needle finding north. The invitation came from Portia, which meant it was not an invitation. It arrived on a Wednesday morning in the form of a bright, pleasant suggestion made in front of Lady Ashford at breakfast. "I thought I might show Miss Voss the East Wing today, and she hasn't seen the full house, and it seems a shame," delivered with the particular warmth of a woman who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply performing the asking. Lady Ashford looked up from her tea with the expression of someone who had been watching Portia operate for 20 years and had reached a state somewhere between exhaustion and dark amusement. "How thoughtful," she said. Evelyn accepted with a small smile and spent the walk to the East Wing constructing, quietly, an accurate picture of what Portia wanted from the exercise. It was not, she had concluded by the time they reached the East Corridor, generosity. The East Wing had been closed for years, not abandoned precisely, but set aside. The floors were clean. The air was cool and still in the way of rooms that are maintained but not inhabited. Dust covers sat over the larger furniture like patient ghosts. The windows were shut, and the light that came through them had the flattened, colorless quality of light that had not been let in for a long time. Portia moved through it with the ease of someone who knew the space well. She talked as she walked the history of each room, the purpose of each piece of furniture, the names and dates and notable achievements of various Ashford predecessors, delivered in the bright, informative tone of a woman who had learned all of this and wanted credit for having done so. Evelyn listened and asked the occasional question, and maintained the expression of someone who was genuinely interested and entirely at ease. She was entirely at ease. That was the part Portia had miscalculated. She had expected Evelyn to be impressed, or intimidated, or at least visibly conscious of the gap between herself and all of this, the portraits, the ceilings, the accumulated weight of 200 years of consequence. She had brought her here to establish a scale and to place Evelyn clearly at the smaller end of it. Evelyn had grown up knowing exactly whose blood ran in her veins. Grandeur did not unsettle her. It felt, if anything, faintly familiar. The portrait gallery was at the far end of the wing. It was a long room with tall windows on one side and portraits on the other, generations of Ashford faces arranged chronologically, each one looking out with the family's characteristic expression of composed authority. Evelyn walked the length of it slowly, Portia beside her, still talking, her voice beginning to carry the faint edge of someone whose plan is not producing the intended results. Evelyn stopped. She stopped because she had to. She had prepared herself for this room, had known, intellectually, that it would contain what it contained, had given herself firm instructions about composure and timing, and the importance of not giving anything away to an audience that was specifically looking for something to use. The preparation was insufficient. The portrait was 3/4 down the wall. A woman, painted in the style of 30 years ago, softer than the more recent work, warmer in its palette, with the slightly idealized quality of a portrait commissioned by someone who loved the subject. She was young in it, dark-haired, seated beside a window with light coming in from the left, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed and just slightly, just barely, amused by something happening outside the frame. Evelyn recognized the hands first, then the way the light sat on the jaw, then the expression. She had seen that expression her entire life, in mirrors. She stood in front of it and could not, for the span of several seconds, move or speak or perform any of the things she had been performing successfully for 11 days. Beside her, Portia had gone quiet. "Who is this?" Evelyn asked. Her voice came out level. She was distantly grateful for that. Portia was looking at the portrait, and then at Evelyn, and then at the portrait again. And Evelyn could see, without turning to look directly, the exact moment that Portia understood what she was seeing. The resemblance was not subtle. The resemblance was, in fact, the kind that stopped people in galleries and made them ask questions. "The late Duke's first wife," Portia said slowly. "She died before she died young. There were no children. The Duke, the current Duke's father, married again after some years. The Dowager is his second wife." Evelyn nodded. She looked at the portrait for 3 more seconds. Then she moved on, continuing down the wall at the same unhurried pace she had maintained throughout. Portia followed. Neither of them said anything else in the portrait gallery. Evelyn heard the door at the far end open before she saw him. The Duke stepped into the gallery from the east entrance and stopped when he found it occupied. His expression cycled through several things in rapid succession: surprise, controlled irritation at the surprise, and then something else entirely as his eyes moved from Portia to Evelyn. Evelyn was standing in front of the last portrait in the row. A man, this one. Dark-haired, sharp-jawed, painted perhaps 20 years ago. The late Duke in early middle age, looking out of the frame with an expression that was, she could see it now, standing this close, considerably more complicated than authority. She had positioned herself there deliberately, without quite planning to, which was the part that unsettled her slightly. The Duke looked at her face, then at the portrait behind her, then at her face again. The gallery was very quiet. Portia said brightly, "We were just finishing the tour, James. Miss Voss hadn't seen the East Wing." The Duke said nothing. He was still looking at Evelyn with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the catalogue glance, not the controlled indifference of dinner time, but something stripped of its usual management. Something that was, for once, not performing anything at all. Evelyn met his eyes for a moment. Then she said pleasantly, "It's a beautiful wing. Thank you for the suggestion, Lady Portia." She turned toward the door. "I should get back to Lady Ashford." She walked out of the gallery at the same unhurried pace she had walked in. Behind her, the silence she left had a different quality from any silence she'd produced in Ashford Manor before. This one had weight. She was halfway down the east corridor when she heard his footsteps behind her. Not Portia's light, deliberate step. The Duke's firm, even the footsteps of a man who had always known the floor was his, except that right now they were slightly faster than usual. She stopped and turned. He was 6 feet away when he stopped. He looked, she catalogued this carefully, like a man who had started moving before he had decided where he was going. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace." A pause. He looked at her the way he had looked at the portrait, like a man trying to read something he hadn't been given the language for. "How long have you been in the East Wing?" he asked. "Perhaps an hour." Lady Portia was kind enough to. "Did you go into the gallery on your own at any point, before today?" Evelyn looked at him steadily. "No, Your Grace, today was my first time." Another pause, longer. "My father," he said, and stopped. Something moved through his expression, careful, reluctant, the movement of a man approaching a door he wasn't certain he wanted to open. He was a man who kept things in order. everything in its correct place. That quality appears to have been inherited, Evelyn said. It came out with slightly more edge than she intended. The Duke blinked. Then, astonishingly, so briefly she nearly missed it, something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The memory of one, perhaps, or the possibility. It disappeared immediately. "Yes," he said. "Well." He looked at her for one more moment with that new, unmanaged expression. Then he turned and walked back toward the gallery. Evelyn watched him go. She turned and continued toward Lady Ashford's rooms. Her hands at her sides were not quite steady. She allowed that privately for the length of the corridor. Then she composed herself and knocked on Lady Ashford's door and went inside. Behind her, somewhere in the east wing, the Duke of Ashford was standing in front of his father's portrait, asking it, silently, a question that had needed asking for 30 years. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, she heard his footsteps in the corridor outside Briggs' door. She heard the knock, the door opening, the low, deliberate sound of a voice asking for something. She did not hear the answer, but she heard very clearly the silence that followed it, the silence of a man receiving information that rearranged everything. Briggs told him everything. Not all at once. That was not Briggs' way, and it was not, Evelyn suspected, the Duke's way either. Two men who communicated in precise, measured units, who had spent 30 years in the same house developing a vocabulary of understatement so refined it had become its own language. They would have done it carefully, methodically, the way you approach something that, once said, cannot be unsaid. She knew because she had done it herself. 4 days of watching and waiting before she approached Briggs in the garden. The careful calibration of how much to ask for and when and in what order. She recognized the shape of it. She just wasn't in the room for it. The Duke did not come to breakfast. Lady Ashford noted his absence without comment, which meant it was not unusual enough to remark on but unusual enough to notice. Portia arrived late and spent the meal in a state of bright, watchful energy that Evelyn recognized as the particular alertness of someone who knew something had shifted and was trying to locate the source. Evelyn drank her tea and read aloud from the novel Lady Ashford had requested, a cheerful thing about a family in Bath with more daughters than sense, and performed complete unconcern with the expertise of someone who had been performing it for 11 days and was, by now, quite good. Inside, she was doing calculations. He knew, or was knowing, which was its own process. The information was in him now, working through him the way cold water works through a man who has been standing in it long enough to stop feeling it. The shock comes later. The cold comes after the numbness. She knew this from experience. She had had 4 months to absorb what Briggs had told him last night in approximately 20 minutes. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she felt sorry for him. Not entirely, but somewhat. He appeared at luncheon. He sat at the head of the table and ate with his usual efficiency, and spoke when spoken to on the subject of a drainage problem on the North Estate, and did not, from the outside, appear to be a man whose understanding of his own history had been reconstructed overnight. Evelyn watched him without appearing to. He was pale, very slightly. The kind of pale that came from not sleeping, managed well but not perfectly. His jaw was set a degree tighter than usual. And once, only once, when the conversation lapsed and the table went momentarily quiet, he looked at Evelyn with an expression that was so unguarded, so completely without its usual armor, that she had to look away first. She who had been looking directly at things her entire life without flinching, she looked away. Portia saw it. Evelyn watched Portia file it efficiently into whatever she was building. He came to find her that afternoon. She was in the library, the real one, the ground floor room, sitting in the window with a letter she had been composing and reconsidering for 3 days. The solicitor, the arrangements, The thing she had come here for, which had seemed so simple and so clear when she planned it from a small house in Yorkshire, and which had become, in 11 days, considerably more complicated. She heard him stop in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She gave him the same 3 seconds she gave everything, enough time to compose herself, not enough to seem evasive. Then she set down the letter and turned. He was standing with his hands behind his back, which she had come to understand was his default posture when he was uncertain. It looked authoritative, but it was actually containment. Something to do with the hands when the hands didn't know what to do. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "May I sit down?" Evelyn blinked. She had not expected that. In 11 days, the Duke of Ashford had not once asked permission for anything in his own house. "Of course," she said. He sat in the chair across from her, not at the desk, not in the position of authority, but the chair across, the equal position, and looked at the window beside her for a moment as though it contained something instructive. "Briggs told me," he said. "I assumed he would. He told me last night. He had been waiting, I think, for the right moment, or for a moment when continuing to wait was no longer." He stopped, started again. "He has known since before I was born." "Yes," the Duke looked at her directly. "My father knew about you." "Yes." "He provided for you, for your mother." "Yes." A pause. His jaw was doing the thing she'd noticed at luncheon, that extra degree of tightness, the pressure of a man keeping something managed. "I did not know," he said. "I want you to understand that. I was not told, and I did not." He stopped. "When I walked past you in the entry hall, when I said, 'Your Grace,'" Evelyn's voice was even, "you didn't know." "That is not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it is a fact, and facts are useful." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, surprise, she thought, and something more complicated beneath it. He had expected, perhaps, recrimination. She had given him instead the same practical clarity she gave everything, and he didn't quite know what to do with it. She understood. She had been giving people things they didn't expect for 26 years. He told her what Briggs had told him in the order that it had apparently been delivered, methodically, quietly, like a man reading from a document he was still in the process of believing. Her mother and his father, young, before the weight of the Ashford name had finished settling onto him. A closeness that the family had identified and terminated with the efficiency of people who understood that sentiment was a luxury the heir to a dukedom could not afford. Her mother, sent away. His father, redirected toward an appropriate match, the first wife, who had died young, and then the second, who sat in the breakfast room every morning with her excellent posture and her tired eyes. And throughout all of it, quietly, consistently, across 30 years, his father maintaining what he could. The house, the bills, the education, the small provisions that said, without ever being able to say it plainly, "I know you exist. I have not forgotten." The Duke stopped speaking. The library was very quiet. "There's a will," Evelyn said. "Yes. I'm in it." He met her eyes. "Yes. A letter and a property, a small estate in Wiltshire held in trust. It was to be transferred to you upon proof of identity and an acknowledgement." He paused on that word, acknowledgement. The weight of it was considerable. "That's what I came for," Evelyn said. "The letter and the property, and yes, the acknowledgement." She looked at her hands for a moment. "My mother didn't tell me directly. She was not the kind of woman who explained her choices. She left me a letter of her own after she died, instructions. She told me to come here to speak to Briggs and to ask for what was owed." Evelyn paused. "She also told me not to cause difficulty." "And have you," he asked, "caused difficulty?" Something shifted in Evelyn's chest, not quite amusement, something adjacent to it. "I applied for a position as a lady's companion and I deadheaded roses with your valet. I think I've been relatively restrained." The Duke looked at her. And then, for the first time fully, without the brief suppression she had seen at the corner of his mouth in the corridor, he almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The face that had never learned to rest came within a remarkable distance of resting. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then his expression shifted, and Evelyn watched him remember something. "Portia," he said. Evelyn waited. His face had returned to its set, contained expression, but with a new quality underneath it, something tighter, colder. "She was listening," he said. "Last night, when Briggs, I heard her in the corridor after. I don't know how much she heard." Evelyn thought of Portia at breakfast. The bright, watchful energy. The way her eyes had moved between Evelyn and the Duke at luncheon, with the efficiency of a woman triangulating. "Enough," Evelyn said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. There are financial interests. The estates entail certain provisions that depend on the structure of the family remaining as she has understood it to be." He said it carefully, precisely, the way he said everything. "If your claim is legitimate." "It is legitimate." "I know." No hesitation, just fact. Clean and immediate and completely without the equivocation Evelyn had half prepared herself for. I know it is. I have looked at you and looked at that portrait, and I am not in any doubt." He paused. "What I am saying is that Portia will not accept it without a fight, and the fight she chooses will not be a private one." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "What kind of fight will it be?" The Duke's expression was exactly the expression of a man who already knows the answer and does not enjoy it. "The kind," he said, "that happens in public." She found out how public on Friday evening. She found out at dinner, which was the correct setting for it, because Portia had always understood that an audience multiplied the effect of everything. They were 5 at the table: Lady Ashford, the Duke, Portia, Evelyn, and a Mr. Harwick, a county magistrate who dined at Ashford Manor once a month, and who had the mild, pleasant face of a man who enjoyed good food and held no strong opinions about anything. He was the audience. Evelyn understood this within 30 seconds of sitting down. Portia waited until the second course. "I had the most interesting conversation today," she said, in the bright tone that Evelyn had learned to treat as a weather warning, "with Mrs. Alcott in the village. She asked me about our new companion." A small, warm smile at Evelyn. "Everyone is curious, naturally, we so rarely have new faces." Evelyn said nothing. She reached for her water glass. "She asked about your family," Portia continued. "I realized I didn't know very much. Your mother was from Yorkshire, you said, and your father, I don't think you've mentioned your father." The table was very quiet. Lady Ashford had gone still in the particular way of a woman who has decided to see what happens before deciding whether to intervene. Mr. Harwick was looking at his plate with the focus of a man wishing he were somewhere else entirely. The Duke had not moved. Evelyn set down her water glass. She looked at Portia. And she said, quite pleasantly, "My father's name is a matter that's currently being handled by a solicitor. I expect it will be resolved very shortly." Portia's smile did not waver. "How mysterious. You'll forgive my curiosity, it's only that certain questions have arisen in the village about the nature of your connections to this house. People talk naturally when a young woman arrives without clear antecedents and inserts herself into a household of—" "Portia," the Duke's voice. Not loud, not heated. Simply final, the single word of a man who had decided, somewhere between the East Wing and this dinner table, exactly where he stood. Portia turned to him with an expression of polite inquiry. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Mr. Harwick, who had stopped pretending to look at his plate and was now watching with the helpless attention of a man witnessing something he would be describing at dinners for years. The Duke set down his fork. "Miss Voss's connections to this house," he said, "are a matter I intend to address properly and formally, very shortly." His eyes moved to Evelyn. "She is here because she belongs here, and because there is something in this house that has been owed to her for 26 years. A pause. That is all that needs to be said tonight. The table absorbed this. Lady Ashford made a small sound, not surprise, Evelyn thought. Something quieter than that. Something that had been waiting. Portia's smile was still in place, but it had changed quality entirely. It was the smile of a woman calculating distances. Mr. Harwick reached for his wine with the energy of a man who had decided that food and drink were, in this moment, his safest options. Evelyn looked at the Duke. He was looking back at her with the expression she had first seen in the East Wing corridor, that unguarded, unmanaged look, the one without its usual armor, but steadier now, more certain. She didn't expect that, some part of her noted. She had come for a letter, for a property, for acknowledgement written in a solicitor's careful hand. He had just acknowledged her at a dinner table in front of a county magistrate. She had not planned for that. She was not, she realized, entirely certain what to do with it. After dinner, walking back to her room, she passed Briggs on the stairs. He looked at her. She looked at him. "He told them," she said quietly. Briggs said nothing for a moment. "Then he is his father's son," he said, "in the ways that matter." Evelyn nodded once and continued up the stairs. Behind her, she heard Portia's voice drifting from the drawing room, bright, reconstructed, pivoting already toward whatever came next. Whatever came next would not be quiet. Evelyn had known that from the moment she stepped out of a hired carriage and looked up at a gray stone house that felt, against all logic, faintly familiar. She went to her room and sat at the small desk and picked up the letter she had been composing for 3 days. She set it aside. Then she took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear Mr. Alcott," she wrote, the solicitor's name, the careful address. "I believe the matter may be approaching its resolution sooner than anticipated. There are certain developments which require your attention." She wrote for 20 minutes, neatly and precisely, the way her mother had taught her. Then she sealed it and set it by the door for the morning post. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept more soundly than she had since arriving at Ashford Manor. The rumors reached the village before breakfast on Saturday. Evelyn did not know this until Mrs. Hale, Lady Ashford's housekeeper, a solid, reliable woman who had the particular quality of knowing everything that happened within a 5-mile radius, and disclosing it only when it became structurally necessary, appeared at Lady Ashford's sitting-room door at 8:30 with an expression that said, plainly, that something had needed disclosing. Evelyn was present. She had been reading aloud the Bath novel, The Daughters, the cheerful domestic catastrophes, when Mrs. Hale knocked, and she closed the book quietly and made to leave. "Stay," said Lady Ashford. Evelyn stayed. The story Portia had put into circulation was elegant in its construction. Evelyn granted her that. It was not a direct accusation. Direct accusations could be disproved, and Portia was too intelligent for anything that could be cleanly disproved. It was instead a series of observations, deployed through the correct channels, a word to Mrs. Alcott, a remark to the vicar's wife, a concerned aside to the magistrate's sister, that assembled themselves in the listener's mind into a picture Portia had never explicitly painted. A young woman, unclear origins, arrived without proper introduction, inserted herself into the household with suspicious ease, seemed to certain observers remarkably comfortable in rooms she should have found intimidating, asked questions, watched people, had perhaps a certain resemblance to, well, one didn't like to say. The implication, fully assembled, was that Evelyn was a schemer, a woman who had identified a vulnerability in the Ashford family history and arrived to exploit it, possibly not who she said she was at all. It was the kind of story that didn't need to be true to be damaging. It only needed to be interesting. And it was, apparently, very interesting. Lady Ashford listened to Mrs. Hale's report without expression. When it was finished, she sat for a moment in the silence of a woman organizing her response. Then she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Hale, that will be all." Mrs. Hale withdrew. Lady Ashford looked at Evelyn. Evelyn met her gaze and waited. She had been waiting in one form or another for 11 days. She was practiced at it. "I have not asked you," Lady Ashford said, "about your mother." "No," Evelyn agreed. "I knew her name." She said it simply, without drama. "My late husband, was not a man who explained himself, but I am not a woman who required explanation. I understood the shape of certain things." She paused. "I did not know about you specifically. I want to be honest about that." "I understand. But I am not surprised." A pause. "Your mother was, I am told, she was a woman of considerable quality." "She was," Evelyn said, "the finest person I have known." Lady Ashford looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated and honest, and more human than anything Evelyn had seen on her face in 11 days of breakfast. "Yes," she said quietly, "I rather thought she must have been." The silence that followed was the most peaceful silence Evelyn had experienced in Ashford Manor. It lasted until the Duke's footsteps sounded in the corridor. He knocked and came in without waiting, which suggested urgency, and stopped when he found both of them looking at him. He looked at his mother, then at Evelyn. "You've heard," he said. "Mrs. Hale is thorough," Lady Ashford said. He came further into the room. He had the look of a man who had been awake since before the rumors reached the house, which meant Evelyn calculated that Portia had not been subtle about her timeline. He had known this was coming. He had been thinking about it since dinner. "There is a dinner tonight," he said. "The Harwicks, County Assembly, 20, perhaps 25 people. Portia will be there." "Of course she will," said Lady Ashford. "I intend to go." He looked at Evelyn. "I would like you to come." Evelyn considered him. "As your mother's companion." "No," the word was immediate, flat, certain. "Not as her companion." As he stopped, the jaw tightened. He was, she understood, in the process of saying something out loud for the first time, which always costs more than saying something the second time. "As my father's daughter, as the person you are, as someone I am introducing properly, which should have been done." He stopped again. "Which should have been done correctly from the beginning." The room was very quiet. Lady Ashford was looking at her son with an expression Evelyn couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something softer, something that might have been, quietly, pride. "Portia will make it unpleasant," Evelyn said. "Yes. She will have prepared things to say. She's had since last night." "I know. It will be a public scene. People will talk regardless of how it resolves." "Miss Voss." The Duke looked at her directly, and his expression was the one from the corridor outside the gallery, unguarded, unarmored, the face of a man who had spent 34 years running everything on efficiency and had arrived, somewhat abruptly, at a situation that efficiency could not solve. "I am aware of the consequences. I am asking you anyway." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "What time does it begin?" She wore the better of her two good dresses, dark blue, simply cut, the kind of dress that announced nothing except that its wearer had not tried too hard, which was its own kind of statement. She put her hair up herself, the way her mother had taught her, neat and plain and without ornament. She looked in the mirror for a moment. Her mother looked back at her, the jaw, the hands, the particular quality of composure that was not coldness but was often mistaken for it. "Don't cause difficulty," her mother had written. Evelyn picked up her gloves. She had not caused difficulty. Difficulty had organized itself around her with considerable enthusiasm and very little help from her. She felt, under the circumstances, that this distinction was meaningful. The Harwick house was lit from every window when their carriage arrived. Evelyn could hear the dinner through the walls' voices, the particular acoustic of 25 people in a formal room performing sociability at each other. She had attended gatherings like this her entire life, though never from this angle, always at the edges, always in the position of someone whose presence was tolerated rather than expected. Tonight was different. The Duke handed her down from the carriage himself. It was a small gesture. She suspected he had not planned it, that his hand had simply extended before the calculation had been made. But she took it, and they walked up the steps, and the footman opened the door and they went in. The room noticed them immediately. Not loudly. It was too well-bred a room for loud noticing. But Evelyn had spent her life reading the quiet registers, the slight pause in a nearby conversation, the redirected glance, the small adjustments that people make when something unexpected has walked through a door. She kept her chin level and her pace unhurried. Portia was at the far end of the room. Evelyn found her in the first 10 seconds, not because she was looking for her specifically, but because Portia was the kind of person who positioned herself in rooms for maximum visibility, and Evelyn had learned to locate that kind of person on instinct. She was with a cluster of county women, Mrs. Alcott among them, and she turned when the Duke and Evelyn entered with an expression that had been prepared. The evening began. It was, as predicted, unpleasant. Not immediately. Portia was too skilled for immediately. She let the room settle. She let the Duke make his rounds, the magistrate, the local landowners, the county business that required his attention. She let Evelyn stand beside Lady Ashford and be introduced, by Lady Ashford, to 3 or 4 women of solid county standing who received her with the careful politeness of people who had heard something, and were now performing the act of not having heard it. Evelyn was gracious and warm and unrattled, which she could see confounded 2 of them considerably. Then Portia moved. She crossed the room during a lull. That was the skill of it, the timing, the selection of the moment when the most people were in proximity, and the ambient volume was low enough for a conversation to carry, and arrived at Evelyn's side with a bright smile and a voice pitched for the surrounding radius. "Miss Voss, how lovely that you could come." The smile. "I do hope you're feeling settled. It must be disorienting, all of this, for someone in your position." Evelyn turned to look at her pleasantly. "My position." "The uncertainty, not knowing quite where one stands." Portia tilted her head. "Certain questions have been raised naturally about the nature of your visit. People are curious about your background, your people. It's only human." "Of course," Evelyn said. "And one does feel, I speak as someone who cares about the family, you understand, one does feel that clarity would benefit everyone. Before things proceed any further." A delicate pause. "Whatever things those might be." The surrounding radius had gone very quiet. Evelyn opened her mouth. "Miss Voss's background," said the Duke, "is not uncertain." He had crossed the room. She hadn't tracked him, which was unusual for her, and was standing 3 feet away with a glass in one hand and an expression of complete, controlled composure. He looked at Portia, and then at the room, and Evelyn watched him make the decision she had seen him approaching all day. He set his glass down on a nearby table. "Her father," he said clearly at a volume calibrated for the room, "was the late Duke of Ashford, my father. She is his daughter, acknowledged in his will and in his private correspondence and confirmed by his solicitor, who will be arriving on Monday to complete the formal arrangements." He paused. "She came to this house to collect what was left to her. She has been received in this house as what she is." Another pause, the smallest one. "My sister, which is what she is, and which is how she will be addressed." The room did not move. 25 people stood in various positions of absolute stillness, holding their drinks, performing the collective act of a county social gathering that had just received more interesting material than it had anticipated. Portia's face had gone through several things in rapid succession, and arrived at a composed, unreadable expression that was costing her considerably. Evelyn stood in the center of all of it and felt, for the first time since a hired carriage had dropped her outside gray stone walls 11 days ago, something release in her chest. Something that had been held tightly and carefully and without complaint for 26 years. Not joy exactly. Not yet. Something quieter and more fundamental than joy. Recognition. Lady Ashford, who had been standing to Evelyn's left, reached over and placed her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Mrs. Alcott, near the back of the room, leaned toward the woman beside her and said something in a low voice. The woman nodded. The calculation was already happening. The recalibration, the revision of the story Portia had given them, the social arithmetic of a county reordering its understanding. Portia was still standing in the center of the room. The Duke looked at her. "I believe," he said, with the pleasant, final tone of a man closing a ledger, "that the soup will be served shortly." He turned to Evelyn and held out his arm. She took it. They walked to the dinner table together, the Duke and his father's daughter, and the room moved around them in the careful, watching way of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed for some time. Evelyn kept her chin level. Her hand on his arm was steady. At the far end of the table she could see Briggs in her mind, not here, back at the manor, sitting in his small room with 30 years of silence finally spent. He had known her name since before she could speak it herself. She sat down at the table. The soup was served. And Evelyn Voss, daughter of the late Duke of Ashford, inheritor of a letter and a property in Wiltshire, and a name that had been waiting for her for 26 years, picked up her spoon and began. 6 months later, Ashford Manor had a different quality to it. Not dramatic, not the kind of change that announced itself. The stone was the same gray. The gardens were still immaculate in the way that suggested no one enjoyed them, though Evelyn had recently suggested to the head gardener that the south beds might accommodate something less disciplined, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting 20 years for someone to say exactly that. Small things. The quality of small things. The property in Wiltshire had been transferred in October, 6 weeks after the Harwick dinner, with the quiet efficiency of legal matters that have been waiting long enough and are finally permitted to resolve themselves. Evelyn had gone to see it on a gray Tuesday morning, alone, which was how she had wanted it. It was a modest estate, not grand, nothing like Ashford Manor, nothing that announced itself from the road. A stone house of sensible proportions set back from a lane lined with elms that had been there for 100 years and intended to be there for 100 more. The gardens were overgrown. The house needed work. The windows on the east side needed replacing entirely. Evelyn had stood in the front drive and looked at it for a long time. Her father had bought it quietly 27 years ago, the year before Evelyn was born. He had maintained it, through a solicitor, without ever visiting. He had left it to her in a will that named her plainly and without equivocation, which had cost him something. She understood that now, understood the courage of a man who had spent his life complying, putting one true thing into a document that would outlast him. She had stood in the drive until the solicitor beside her grew slightly cold and slightly restless. Then she had gone inside. The letter was read on a Wednesday. Briggs brought it to her himself, not handed it off to a footman, not left it on a tray. He brought it personally, to the small sitting room she used in the mornings, and placed it on the table beside her tea with the careful deliberateness of a man completing something he had been carrying for a very long time. She waited until he had gone. Then she opened it. Her father's handwriting. She had never seen it before. It was nothing like her mother's, larger, less precise, the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly and thought faster than his hand could follow. The date at the top was 11 years ago. She had been 15. She read it once straight through without stopping. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the gray November garden for a while. He had not written it well. He had written it honestly, which was harder and more valuable, and she found she preferred the honesty to any elegance he might have managed. He wrote about her mother with a directness that must have cost him. He wrote about his own failures without the softening language men of his position typically used to describe their failures. He wrote about Evelyn, whom he had never met, whose face he had never seen. with a specificity that suggested he had thought about her considerably more than distance and silence had allowed him to demonstrate. At the end, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the rest, as though the hand had finally outrun the composure entirely, he had written, "I did not do enough. I knew it then and I have known it every year since. What I am leaving you is not sufficient recompense for that. It is what I have to give, and I give it completely, and I ask nothing in return except that you know whatever else you were told or not told, whatever shape the world took around you without my being in it, that you were known. You were not forgotten. You were, in the way available to a man who had run out of better options, loved." Evelyn read it twice more. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, where she carried it for the rest of the day without taking it out again. Portia left for Bath in November. It was announced as a visit, the winter season, friends, the usual social reasons, and everyone in the county understood it to be what it was, which was a strategic withdrawal to a position from which she could reconstruct. She left with her customary composure and said goodbye to Evelyn with the polished grace of a woman who had recalibrated, and was too intelligent to carry visible resentment into a situation she could not win. Evelyn shook her hand and wished her a pleasant journey and meant it genuinely because she bore Portia no malice. Portia had wanted something and had fought for it in the way available to her. Evelyn understood that impulse entirely. She just hadn't lost. The relationship between Evelyn and the Duke was not simple. She had known it wouldn't be. You could not compress 26 years of absence into 6 months of adjacency and arrive at something uncomplicated. There were awkward dinners. There were conversations that stopped at exactly the wrong moment. There were days when she could see him recalibrating, looking at her, and seeing his father, or seeing the shape of a history he hadn't been given, or simply struggling with the ordinary difficulty of having a sister he had not been raised to have. She gave him room for all of it. She had not come to Ashford Manor for simplicity. What they had built was careful and real and theirs, which was more than either of them had started with. He had begun in small ways to ask her opinion on things. The estate management, sometimes, she had a better head for figures than he initially expected, which had produced one memorable dinner conversation when she identified an error in the Carlton correspondence he'd been trying to resolve for 3 weeks. He had looked at her for a full 5 seconds before he responded. She had eaten her soup and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. He had laughed just briefly, the real version unmanaged, the laugh of a man surprised into it. She had filed it away with the roses. In December, a new family arrived in the county. They came with a letter of introduction to Ashford Manor, a Mr. and Mrs. Fontaine, recently arrived from London, with 3 daughters and the unmistakable energy of people who had come to a county specifically to be noticed by it. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, which was slightly irregular, and were received in the entry hall by Briggs while the Duke was occupied with estate business. Evelyn happened to be crossing the hall. Briggs caught her eye. She understood the look immediately. He would want to know, but he's in the middle of the Carlton figures and I'd rather not. Evelyn stopped. "Mr. and Mrs. Fontaine," she said pleasantly. "Welcome to Ashford Manor. I'm afraid His Grace is occupied at present, but I'm happy to receive you. I'm Miss Voss." Mrs. Fontaine opened her mouth. Then she paused, with the expression of a woman recalibrating mid-sentence. "Miss Voss," she said carefully, "forgive me, are you?" "The Duke's sister," Evelyn said, simply, without drama, the way you say a thing that has become, in 6 months, simply true. "Yes." Mrs. Fontaine's expression completed its recalibration and arrived at warm, slightly awed cordiality. Her husband bowed. The 3 daughters looked at Evelyn with the bright, assessing attention of young women trying to determine the exact nature of every social relationship in a new county. Evelyn smiled at them and rang for tea. She told the Duke about it at dinner. He listened with the particular quality of attention he had developed for stories about Evelyn navigating the county on his behalf, focused, slightly dry, ready to be amused. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You introduced yourself as my sister," he said. It seemed the most efficient description. Another pause. "Yes," he said, "it is." He reached for his wine. Then he set it down without drinking it and looked at her with the expression she had first seen in an East Wing corridor, unguarded, unarmored, except that now it was quieter, more settled. The expression of a man who had arrived somewhere and recognized it as somewhere he intended to stay. "I should have introduced you myself," he said, "6 months ago, the day you arrived." Evelyn looked at him. "You didn't know," she said. "We've established this." "I know now." "Yes," she picked up her own wine. "You do." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once with the clean finality of a man closing an account. Matter settled, filed correctly, complete. Evelyn drank her wine. Across the table, Lady Ashford watched them both with the quiet expression of a woman who had made peace, somewhere in the last 6 months, with a history she hadn't chosen and a present that had turned out, against considerable odds, to be all right. Later that evening, Evelyn passed Briggs on the staircase. It had become, in 6 months, a habit, this particular staircase, this particular hour, the small daily accounting of two people who understood the shape of the same story from different angles. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The Fontaine family," she said. "Did you know them?" "No," Briggs said, "new to the county." "The youngest daughter has her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. She'll cause someone a great deal of trouble in about 3 years." Briggs considered this. "Should I warn anyone?" "Not yet," Evelyn said. "Let it develop." She continued up the stairs. Briggs watched her go. He had known her name for 30 years. He had watched it be spoken at a county dinner in front of a magistrate and 24 witnesses. He had watched it be given back to her, properly, by the son of the man who should have given it himself. He had watched a woman arrive at this house in a hired carriage that smelled of other people's journeys, with a single trunk and a composure so complete it had taken him 11 days to see what it was costing her. And he had watched her, in 6 months, become entirely and unmistakably at home. He turned off the lamp at the foot of the stairs. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, the particular quiet of old stone and long history, and people who had, finally, been placed correctly in the rooms they belonged in. He had known her name for 30 years. It had taken the Duke considerably less time to learn what it was worth. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.